Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to your beautiful country. I'd like to give you a rundown on IDF's challenges, nowadays challenges, because despite of all the changes in the Middle East, we still have some serious issues, I would say, that we deal with in Israel. And I would like to give you a rundown from the different borders, the different challenges that we have in Israel. And I would like to start with the northern border, the border with Lebanon. Basically, as you remember, we had the second Lebanon war in 2006. And Hezbollah, since that war, Hezbollah was busy in doing two things. The first one was to reach the Lebanese parliament, as it, as you know, did rightly and managed to get there. And today they can veto basically any decision. And the second effort was actually a military one. And I'm referring to the efforts of trying to change the military tactic. During the Second Lebanon War, most of the weapons of Hezbollah were well inside Lebanon. So I would say 75% were well inside Lebanon, and 25% were located at the border with Israel, the southern part. They changed this tactic. For the past 3 years, they were busy in taking those 160 villages on the border of Lebanon and Israel, Lebanese villages, and really digging underneath those villages. They basically duplicated what's over the ground, underground. And they built a system of tunnels, they built warehouses with weaponry, they built outposts, military bases. So today the tactic have changed. The majority of weapons is actually concentrated in those 160 villages in the southern part of Lebanon. And if you recall the term human shield, this is something that I would say terror organizations in our area actually professionalized. And this is another glimpse that allows you to see maybe what will happen if a future event will take place. Because when you place a warehouse full of missiles and rockets next to a school or a mosque, then of course you are endangering the lives of the civilians. And as I said, we're talking in 160 villages, not just one or two. So this is tens of thousands of civilians that live in those places. I can tell you that since the second war in Lebanon, the border itself was pretty quiet in the Israeli side. However, from the Lebanese side, we see convoys of missiles brought from the Syrian side to the Lebanese side on a weekly basis. And since there is no inspection, we estimate the rockets today in Lebanon in something around 44,000. Of course, I'm talking about the rockets that Hezbollah has. So this is our estimation. We know that they have missiles and rockets that can pretty much cover the entire state of Israel. And as you hear from time to time, Nasrallah's public declarations, he's not looking for peace. He's talking about kidnapping more soldiers, he's talking about flaring up the border, and so on. So this is the situation right now in the border with Lebanon, building up a very strong military force on the other side of the border, using civilians as human shields, and preparing for maybe further escalation, which we hope will never come. Let's move on to the Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. Between 2000 and 2006, Israel has suffered one of the worst period of times. We were attacked with the phenomenon of suicide bombers. We lost lives of 1,000 Israelis and Arab Israelis due to suicide bombers. By the way, 50% of those suicide bombers were Hamas. I don't know if you know this, but 50% of them were from Hamas. As a result, we had to protect ourselves. The suicide bombers came from within Judea and Samaria, and we had to build a security fence. Now, the security fence is 492 kilometers of a fence that has sensors on it. It's not that you get electrocuted when you touch it, but it allows us to send a patrol to the same area which was touched. There are sensors all over the fence, and if someone tries to infiltrate into Israel, we can send a patrol. 492 kilometers, 3/4 of the fence were complete. And since 2006, which 3/4 of the fence was complete, we had no suicide bombers coming here from Judea and Samaria. Zero. 2006 was the last year. We had 4 suicide bombers, but that was the last year. From 2007, no infiltrators from Judea and Samaria. As a result, we started a new security equation. And the equation has a few components. The first component, as I said, was the security fence. The second component was the roadblocks, or the checkpoints. We have removed in the past 3 years, and I'm not sure it was published in the Norwegian press, but we have removed in the past 3 years over 200 checkpoints. Over 200. Most of them were temporary, but there were others as well. Today, if I would be a Palestinian living in Jenin, which is the northern part of Judea and Samaria, and would want to drive to Hebron, which is all the way the south part, I wouldn't have to cross in any checkpoint. So the second equation is the roadblocks. Until today we still find, from time to time, I would say once every few weeks, we still find people that have on their body explosive belt or trying to smuggle IEDs or something like that. So we still find it today. However, those roadblocks that were removed or checkpoints have not returned at this point. This is the second part of the equation. The third part was the American general at the time, General Dayton, that took a force of Palestinian policemen and trained them in Jordan. Now imagine, Judea and Samaria consists of 2.4 million Palestinians, and they had no form of law and order whatsoever. No police stations, no jails, nothing. So of course there were a lot of theft and crime in the streets and so on. General Dayton did something very smart. He took those people, trained them in Jordan, gave them the best gear possible. And then they returned to Judea and Samaria and actually began to take crime off the streets. And this also helped to stabilize that area. This is the third part of the equation. The fourth part is looking for those specific terrorists inside Judea and Samaria, and they're still there, unfortunately, today. We do have some cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. We have dozens of meetings on the tactical level. I don't know if you heard of this before, but my fellow colleagues in the Judea and Samaria division in the IDF meet with them dozens of times a year with their counterparts, Palestinian counterparts. And they sit together, they plan things together, they talk with each other, dozen times a year. As a result of this equation, the economy in Judea and Samaria has thrived. And it's really ironic because elsewhere in the world in 2007 there was a big crisis. But in Judea and Samaria something actually opposite happened. If in the beginning of 2000, 2001, 2003, the unemployment rate, for instance, was something like 31, 32%, nowadays we're talking about something of 15%. There are millions of tourists that go and visit Bethlehem and Jericho. They're building a new city near Nablus. It's called Ro'abi, which means that people have time and money to buy more apartments. The export of vehicles have gone up. The opening hours of the border with Jordan was extended because they're exporting through Jordan. By the way, they're exporting anything you want, starting from clothes, marble, stones, and shoes, everything. So the situation there has stabilized a great deal. And we're hoping that it will stay that way, of course, in the future. This is the West Bank. Now let's talk about Gaza and Hamas. Gaza has 1.5 million Palestinians living there. Not sure if you know about this, but 50% of those people are children, aged 15 years and under. So next time you read a heartbreaking article about the unemployment rate in Gaza, you have to know those details about the population, because if 50% are kids 15 years and under, and then you have 200,000 more people who are elderly or maybe crippled and things like that, then you have a small number to begin with. There is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There is a border with Egypt that has 14.5-kilometer length and has something between 300 and 350 tunnels. There's actually a tunnel industry of smuggling. Of course, if you want to operate a tunnel, you have to pay Hamas tax. Otherwise, you won't be able to operate a tunnel. Now, anything goes in that tunnel, starting from Grad rockets, which are rockets that can hit something like 40 to 60 kilometers inside Israel, going into cars, electric appliances, even animals, anything you can think of. In 2000, the range of the rockets, the homemade rockets that Hamas and other organizations in Gaza produced, manufactured, was 4 kilometers. Today, it's over 40 kilometers. And this is only in 11 years. Since 2000, we had something like 11,000 rockets and mortars shelled at us. And if the notion is that it falls on some remote little village called Sderot that has 20,000 people, that's not the situation. And just last night, another rocket hit not far from the city of Ashkelon. Just the city of Ashkelon has 150,000 people. So this is a very nice place, Oslo. Imagine that you would have to sit for 10 years in shelters and run within 15 seconds of the alarm. The alarm, by the way, says color red. You have to run to shelters, and this is how you live for 10 years. I mean, it's unacceptable. By the way, approximately 1/5 of those rockets that Hamas is launching falls on Palestinian land in Gaza. Of course, you won't hear any complaints from the Gazans, but believe me, they don't like it. In the last year, the activity in the Gaza Strip actually moved to the fence surrounding Gaza. There's also a fence that has some electronics in it, and also, once again, to try and prevent infiltration attempts. In 2010, we had an average of 1 every 3 days of planting an ID, trying to target either soldiers or just Israeli civilians working on fields, because one of the main sources of income in that area is agriculture. And they have very long plantations, large plantations that reach all the way almost to Gaza. So once every 3 days, we had an event. The situation in Gaza is tense. However, we are not looking for any escalation. In the past 2 weeks, we had something like 80 rockets and mortars that were fired at us. And by the way, the days of the home manufacture Qassam rocket are long gone. I mean, in 2000, they manufactured a rocket. They mixed fertilizers and powder, mix it together, and it had actually a very short shelf life, because when you have this homemade rocket, you have to use it within 3 or 4, maximum 5 days. But today, since everything is being smuggled, you have just ordinary, legitimate Grad rockets. And they can last forever and forever. So as I said, in the past 2 weeks, we had something like 80 rockets that were launched at us. We're not looking for any escalation. We're just looking for defending our people, our civilians. We don't have any presence in Gaza since 2005. We have left Gaza. There is a border with Egypt. There is a crossing with Egypt, and the Egyptians actually open it a few times a week as they decide. It's nothing that has to do with Israel. It's their decision. But to be an Israeli living in one of those areas in the south is not a simple way of life. It's very challenging. There are children that were born to this kind of situation, and to put kids in school and train them a few times a year to hide under the table whenever they hear an alarm, this is not something normal for a Western country, but this is how we live. You know that in the first 3 days when the school year opens, we are escorting, the IDF is escorting the children to school for the first 3 days, just to give them a sense of confidence. And this is for 10 years. We understand that Hamas has a very close linkage to Damascus. As you know, Khaled Mashal, director of Hamas, has a nice office in Damascus. And we were able to see that in Kasled, if you recall. They met together for consultation. So this is the challenges that we have, in short, in the IDF. As you see, it's not an easy challenges, and we're not living in a quiet environment. Hopefully, the situation will stabilize. I mean, the events that are taking place around us, actually, we have to follow and monitor them to see what the next days will bring. It's hard to say that things have stabilized at this point. Processes are still going on. We are expecting many protests tomorrow with the Rage Day in Syria, for example. By the way, the Israeli-Syrian border is the quietest one ever in the past 40 years. So thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions later on.
Then Hanne Eggen Røislienreligionsviter will take the floor.
to stick to the 15 minutes I've been given. I've actually written something out. But I'm very honored to be here, and I'm very excited to be here, and I'd say thank you all for coming. It's really impressive. I am looking forward to the discussion afterwards, but I've been given the opportunity to actually speak before you, so I will start and do that, and I will spend my 15 minutes, about 12 to 15, on Israel and notions and prospects of peace and democracy. I think the title of the seminar is really intriguing. A new reality in the Middle East, what are the prospects for peace and democracy? It's interesting that the title implies, if it implies the question if there really is a prospect for peace and democracy, and no longer, not necessarily whether we will see a peace and what type of democracy we will see. While we were all really euphoric in January and February, the mood has now changed. All Middle East enthusiasts' hearts were beating really strongly for the Middle East in the early parts of this year. But now the mood has really changed, and I think although our hearts were beating strongly and passionately and eagerly in the hope that we would finally see peace and stability in the region, the latest reports from Libya are not very encouraging. Or at least there is no doubt now that the road from authoritarian regimes to a vital and stable democracy is strenuous and time-consuming. But still, no matter how we describe the changes or revolutions in the region, there is always this little state that really stands out. So I will continue to talk about Israel, as I've been asked to by the organizers. Among the most conspicuous features or aspects of the Israeli reaction to what is going on in the region now is really the absence of a reaction. In the early phases of the Egyptian revolt, Israeli state leaders Netanyahu and Peres murmured a few words about support for Barak, skepticism towards rapid changes in Egypt. But since then, the Israeli reaction has been strikingly reticent and restrained. Israel appears to be on the fence, awaiting the outcome of the reorganization of the entire neighborhood. One thing that appears likely, should the Arab revolts result in a series of Middle Eastern democratic states, it is that Israel's strategic significance in the region may change quite drastically in the wake of these last few months' developments. Israel may, in other words, end up being surrounded by democracies and not authoritarian regimes. That may change not only Israel's identity, but also its position in the international diplomatic arena. Moreover, one potential outcome of the region's reorganization may also be, and I'm not saying that it will be, a regional and popular impatience amongst the Arab populations in finding a solution to the situation of the Palestinians. However, on the flip side of the coin, should the revolts and revolutions not turn into viable democracies, and we still don't know the outcome of the current processes in the region, the strategic picture may be completely different. It may potentially also strengthen Israel's position as a counterweight to authoritarian regimes. Another factor when it comes to the regional strategic picture is also the question of the extent to which what I would nearly call anti-Israelism will be one of these state new formations, will be on these new state formations' political agendas. But instead of speculating, because there are so many questions and really so few answers, I think we should turn our attention to what occurs within Israel these days, which is really very interesting. And when answering the question, what are the prospects for peace and democracy in the Middle East, focusing on Israel is important. Israel is a Middle Eastern country. It's a significant country, and Israeli views on peace and democracy matters. And of course, prospects of peace and democracy in the region is intrinsically linked to Israelis' views on cooperation, democracy, equal rights, diplomacy, and perhaps even trust. And I mean trust as in confidence and reliance in establishing stable relationships with Arab populations in general and with the Palestinians in specific. So here, when it comes to Israelis' position towards the question of trust, I think it's interesting that we actually have very recent numbers and statistics that we can turn to and feed into also the discussion here in Norway. Less than a year ago, a large public opinion poll was conducted in Israel among a representative sample of Jewish and Arab respondents, about 2,000. It was released in late December. The survey focused on the public's assessment of the practice of democracy in Israel and the level of support for and satisfaction with Israeli democracy. The purpose of this survey was to gauge the public's views on a series of democratic values, on cooperation with the surrounding countries, on cooperation internally between Jews and Arabs, and the prospect for a two-state solution. The findings are interesting, and I think they stand in a rather sharp contrast to the trend we see in the rest of the region. So I'll just sort of recapitulate and go through some of the findings, the major findings in the Democracy Index. While there is a broad support for the assertion that Israel must remain a democratic state, the Israeli public tends to characterize the country's democracy as weak and ineffective. The preferred solution is a more centralized government. The bulk of the survey respondents, more than 60%, ascribe advantages to an authoritarian government and a strong leadership, which, as they see it, solve problems efficiently. This does not exactly echo the tone in the rest of the region. Israelis are disappointed by the low degree to which their preferences, as reflected in the voting patterns, influence the government's policies. The majority, also over 60%, prefer a regime made up of experts who would make decisions based on professional considerations rather than on political considerations. Israelis have no trust in political considerations. This is compounded by disappointment with the functioning of elected bodies and a lack of trust in the Knesset and in basically all the political parties. But as in the past, there is one institution that stands out, and the Israel Defense Forces enjoys an incredible level of trust on the part of the Israeli public. The trust of the IDF, strong or quite strong trust, is reflected by about 80% of the Israeli population. It's actually a lot higher than the Norwegian. Combat motivation and readiness to serve in Israel remains between 78 to 89%. In Norway, it's about 40. But of the Jewish public, about 86% believe that critical decisions for the state should be taken by a Jewish majority, not by Arabs. And a total of 53% maintain that the state is entitled to encourage Arabs to emigrate from Israel. But perhaps most surprisingly, this year, as in previous years, the Democracy Survey, which is undertaken every year, it has been undertaken every year the last nearly 20 years, indicates an unwavering optimism in the public's attitude towards Israel's future. Although the majority of Israelis are troubled by corruption, have lost faith in politicians, are convinced that another war will break out in the next few years, perhaps even this year, they continue to want to live in Israel, they're proud of their state, and they feel that they belong to the Israeli collective. The notion that citizenship is a legal status conferring to equal rights, and the whole topic of citizenship has, as we know, been a topic on the political agenda this week. There was a law passed 2 days ago. I don't know if you will talk more about that later, but there was a law passed, I think it was 2 days ago, that enables Israeli citizenship to those acting against the state interests. But anyway, 51% of the general public supports full equality rights of Jews and Arabs. But a breakdown of the Jewish public by level of religiosity shows that the greater the level of religious observance, the stronger the objection to equality of rights between Jews and Arabs. While only less than 30% of secular Jews are opposed to such equal rights, 51% of traditional Jews are opposed to equal rights, 65% of religious Jews, and nearly 4 out of 5 ultra-Orthodox are against equal rights for Jews and Arabs. And lastly, almost 2/3 of the Jewish sample feel that as long as Israel is in a state of conflict with the Palestinians, the views of Arab citizens of Israel on foreign affairs and security issues should not be taken into account. This is also reflected to This is seen in combination with how also Jewish Israelis look at the final solution and a two-state, that means a two-state solution, which indicates separation. That means a Jewish and a Palestinian state, and the separation of the two populations. But let me finish by a few words on trust, because I think that's really one of the key issues here. I think examining the extent of Jewish Israelis' tolerance of neighbors with the other, you could also go into how you define the other. In this sample, your relation to the other has also been asked. The respondents were asked to define who they considered to be the other. And that was also interesting, because it also describes a lot where you actually live. It includes immigrants from Russia, ultra-Orthodox, settlers, homosexuals, foreign workers, Arabs. It's a long list. But anyway, examining the extent of Jewish Israelis' tolerance for living next to the other, what they see as the other, it reveals that the neighborly relationships considered most troubling is that with the Arabs, not just with the Palestinians, but with the Arabs in the entire region. Israelis continue to emphasize that they feel that they are a small national state in a very big region of hostile Arab countries. The Jews and Arabs in Israel hold stereotypes and negative views of one another. While 51% of Arab respondents agreed, or definitely agreed, with a statement that Jews are racist, similar questions attest to the attitudes of the Jewish public towards the Arab minority. Jewish respondents were asked about their agreement with the statement, Arabs are inclined to violent behavior. 3 out of 4 of the Jewish respondents also agreed to this statement. So what can this tell us of the prospects of peace and democracy? Perhaps not much. I'm often given a question by the Norwegian press with reference to the situation, both inside of, what is considered by the Norwegian public as an escalation, and also what is happening in the region. So what should Israel do? Or what will Israel do? I must stress that I'm an academic and it's not really my position to offer policy advice to or on behalf of Israel. But the counter question is still, what can Israel do in the current situation in the Middle East? And I think the answer is quite simple. Absolutely nothing, other than preparing for a whole series of possible scenarios. And as I see, that is exactly what Israel is doing right now, with the IDF on the forefront. Thus, when it comes to the state of affairs in Israel's neighboring states, I cannot see that there is any reason to expect that Israel can, will, or should interfere unless Israel, of course, feels its security being explicitly and directly threatened. But this leads us into speculations again, so it's hard not to end with a cliche. We have so many questions and so few answers. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much to Avital and Hanne for reminding us of the severity facing Israel and the challenges that it is facing. Now, I will broaden the picture somewhat. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Now, I'm not here primarily in the capacity as a legal scholar. I'm here more as a Middle Eastern scholar, having worked with the Arab world for a number of years. Now, I will say a few words about the current situation and make some assessments about, are we now going into a phase with more security, more peace, and more democracy, or less of all three? Now, I was struck as well by the title of this small panel. What is missing is the word that we most commonly use when we refer to the Middle East, which is stability. So, for the last 4 decades, our approach, or the Western approach anyway, to the Middle East has been one of securing stability for a number of reasons that we are very well acquainted with. Now, increasingly over the 5 years since the well, let's say, the Iraqi invasion left an Iraq in a state of civil war, and a number of parliamentary elections in the entire Arab world turned out to give a substantial rise to political Islamist parties, the Western countries seem to agree that we will stick to stability still in the Middle East. Now, that has now come to hit us back with a vengeance, it appears. I must say that despite the problems that we're currently seeing in Libya primarily, increasingly in Syria, in Bahrain, in Yemen, where the Arab Spring is about to turn very violent, it seems, my heart is still beating for this Arab Spring. Why? Because this is something that we could never expect to be non-violent. It's a kind of transition that will never be very similar to that we had in Eastern Europe because of the state of affairs in these countries. Now, in terms of making an assessment about whether there will be more security, more peace, or more democracy following the changes that we're currently seeing, I think we need to look at what do we measure it with. Are we comparing this to the last 10 to 20 years? Then obviously we will have less stability at least. But is this the correct measurement? I don't think so. I think that the correct comparison must have to be the situation in the next 5 to 10 years if it had continued unchanged. And with this measurement, I think the equation changes. Why is that? Well, because over the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen a very particular development in the entire Arab region. We have seen that current regimes have proven incapable of responding to the basic needs of their populations. Demographic explosions and dwindling resources are giving indicators that this would sooner or later really implode. I mean, we can take Saudi Arabia. It's a country where 60% of the population is below the age of 18. The average age of rulers is 82. Now you can think for yourself what kind of societies these are. And if you add the layers that you have in a number of the Arab societies, this is what you get. Over the past 8 years, the UN Arab Human Development Reports, not officially UN documents, but still endorsed by the UN, have increasingly shown, together with other reports from the World Bank, the IMF, and other international institutions, increasingly realizing that these regimes are not at all able to cope with the future challenges of these societies. They have concluded in a certain way that we are heading for a catastrophe if these regimes remain as they have been. This is the first thing. The second thing is that over the past 10 years, perhaps even the past 20, we have seen an increased sectarianism in the entire Middle East, a revival of ethnic and religious sectarianism. Now, this is a difficult issue. It has a number of explanations. It has certainly been fueled by the intervention or invasion in Iraq in 2003 and what happened in the aftermath, March. But this is a wider phenomenon, and I don't think we can exclusively blame the Iraqi situation. I think it has traces going back to the 1990s, and must be, the explanation is wider and deeper than simply one or two conflicts. Now, the problem of this sectarianism is that it has historical roots and it does not at all coincide with current borders. It is extremely difficult to control, and it has a dynamic of its own. And I think that a number of actors over the past 10 to 15 years in the Middle East, they have been instrumentalizing and playing with this sectarian feelings between Shiites and Sunnis, between Jews and Christians and Muslims, between Kurds and Arabs, Turks and Berbers and so forth, and Persians, of course. And the point is that these are dynamics that are very difficult to control. It exploded in everybody's face in 2006 in Iraq. I think a number of actors that have been using this, such as Iran, such as, well, at least certain elements in Saudi Arabia and in Syria, and non-state actors as well, they realize that this is something we cannot control. But that does not prevent actors from utilizing this for rather petty objectives. So they are fueling into this sectarianism that is very difficult to control and has this spiraling effect. The third issue that has happened over the past years in the Arab world, now we're focusing on the Arab world, is the ascendancy of two major players, regional players with a lot and increasing influence. One is Iran, also for a number of reasons that we will not go into, and the second is Turkey. Now these two players, they have very different tools of operating, and they have, well, different strategic objectives, we may say. But they have been fishing in the pond of Arab frustrations. And they have largely been utilizing, in order to kind of gain the support and trust of Arab populations, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because this is a very effective instrument if you want to kind of play with the Arab street. For a number of reasons, but also because the Arab regimes, they have been using the Israeli-Arab conflict over decades to explain the state of affairs in the Arab world. And the Arab populations are used to being given explanations such as in Egypt, why is Eritrea and why is Ethiopia, Meles and Uganda and Sudan not happy with the current way we distribute the water in the Nile? Now the official Egyptian explanation is that it is a Zionist complot. Now when you have been fed with this type of information over a sufficient number of years, it influences the way that you look at the world. So the instrumentalization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict primarily by Iran and Turkey in the Arab populace should not be underestimated. The third actor fishing in this pond or sea of frustration is obviously extremist Islamist movements, Al-Qaeda or other type of more radicalized Islamist movements. Now to a certain extent also the more moderate ones, and well, what are moderates and what are non-moderates is obviously something that we can dispute, but they have been, as you can see, we have had regimes that have frozen the situation, a lot of frustration underneath, and increasingly actors playing with this. Now this is the scenario that we have to compare with. If we speak about more security, more stability, and more peace, it is what is now coming after we have kind of taken off the pressure on the Arab populations to a certain extent and let the steam out. Now, we don't know what is coming, but we know that some steam is coming out, and what would have been the case if that had not happened. And I believe that in terms of increased stability, if that is what we compare it to, yes, I think that the Arab world over the next 5 to 10 years, and the Middle East, including Israel, will be a more stable place. Not more stable than what we have seen for the next 10 years, but it will be more stable than what we would otherwise have seen. And if I just then have 2 minutes, 1 minute. Oh yeah, okay, thank you, excellent. Now, how will this turn out for democracy? Now if I have 5, I can say this. Okay, what have we seen over the past months? We have seen a revival, and this is quite surprising to a number of observers, myself very much included, a revival of national patriotism. Now what does that do in the Arab world? It reintroduces something that has been missing for a long time. And I think that it introduces a new element which is potentially very positive. Why? Because it seems to reduce the regional sectarianism. We have seen in Tunisia attacks on synagogues in the aftermath of the revolution. The reaction from most Tunisians to those attacks was that you are trying to sabotage our revolution. We include the Jews among the Tunisians because we are not primarily Muslims, we are primarily Tunisians. In Egypt, with the attacks on the church, now Egypt has a long tradition and an increasing dynamic of problem between the Christians and the Muslims. as well, and they have had that for years. But the reaction among most Egyptians to the attack on the church outside of Cairo was that this is an attempt to take away our new Egypt. And they went together, the Muslim Brotherhood and everyone with Christians went together to protect our new Egypt. Now, and this is something that we're also seeing in a number of different countries. So we have kind of introduced a counter force to this very, very unruly sectarianism. And this is something that really, I think, is a positive sign in the Middle East. Now, the second thing is obviously, I came back from the Middle East on Sunday. And I was struck by my conversations with, in particular, ordinary people about how we now have a hope or a belief in the future. Now it may be dark, but we have a belief that the future will be different. And we should not underestimate the kind of psychological effect that this has on individuals and on collective entities. Now, and that is basically the thing. We have now a belief in a collective cause. Now, is that collective cause the cause of Islam? We don't know that. For the time being, it seems that it isn't. For the time being, it seems that it is the cause of Egypt, and the cause of Tunisia, and the cause of Bahrain, and the cause of Syria. Now, we don't know whether that will actually remain the case, because the challenges facing these societies that all the reports over the past 10 years have shown, they are not disappearing with these new regimes. The new regimes will be fragile, and they will face enormous social and economic challenges. Now, the potential for those states then to channel this into conflict, well, we know that it is a huge risk. And we know that a number of actors are still playing. But I think that the amount of space for Iran to fish in the Arab pond, for Al-Qaeda to continue to gather support and muster support, has been substantially limited by the current development that we're seeing. So if that is the perspective, I think it is a very good thing. Now, what kind of democracy will we have? Now, we don't know that. And I think that we will not have democracy far from all countries. There is a big difference between the societies in the Gulf and North Africa, where North Africa has, in particular, I think, Egypt and Tunis, perhaps also Morocco with time, a rather huge potential for democracies in a kind of European way. But it will be more like the Turkish model, and it will be substantially more conservative than Turkey, probably. Are they going to be liberal democracies? I very much doubt it. Are they going to be majority rule? Most probably. Now, then, what about the rights of the minorities in these countries? Because how we basically define a democracy is precisely by protecting the rights of minorities. And this is also a huge challenge in the Arab world, given its close link to a Muslim tradition where they think in collective rights. They have an emphasis on a kind of collective rights system where you protect the rights of the family, perhaps of the tribe, but at least of the religious community that we don't have. So it will be different from the type of democracies that we have on the northern side of the Mediterranean. When it comes to the Gulf, there is the Iranian equation. In Yemen, in Bahrain, and in all the types of movements that we see, and even in Syria, where the protests are linked somehow to the Shiite equation, there is the Iranian question behind. Does that mean that the Gulf is kind of left at the outside of this? I don't think so. I think that the dynamics introduced, we cannot kind of quell them, or nobody can quell them, we or the regimes that are currently in the Middle East. I think that if we see change in Iran coming from within, and there are possibilities that that will happen over the next couple of years, if we get the same mixture of the green movement and support from the broad masses because of their changing economic situation, then the entire Gulf can look completely different. As long as Iran remains what it is today, I think the kind of lit on the Gulf is still very much present, and any type of attempt to do something about it will be repressed, and it will be supported by a number of actors, because the alternative is basically very, very dangerous. Now, the last question, or what will this do for security? I think in terms of human security, generally the changes will be good. When it comes to the kind of security that we may be concerned with, the growth of organizations such as Al-Qaeda and radical Islamist movements, I think that the current situation is creating pockets of opportunity for them, such as Yemen, such as potentially Libya. But these are manageable. These are manageable threats. I think that the alternative scenario, where Al-Qaeda was increasingly fishing in the pond of Arab frustrations, and we have seen over the past years that Al-Qaeda has kind of returned to its base in the Arab world, I think that was a very dangerous situation. And I think that with the type of changing alliances, the volatile situation, with an increasingly nuclear Iran, that was becoming a deadly mix. So in this aspect, I think that we're not very good off, but we are better off than what we would otherwise have been.